Well, everyone, it's time for us to go and take a look at the Google Pixel 4a and see how this particular phone holds up in 2025. Now, there's a few things to keep in mind here. Number one, with the Pixel 4a, this phone has actually started to make kind of some runway on the news now again, which is actually pretty insane. So we'll talk about that particular, the reason why the Google Pixel 4a is kind of back in the news cycle again very soon. But starting off, if you want to pick up some phones that I would recommend buying this year, links will be down in the description below. You can get them from there and you can help support the channel at the exact same time. Now, starting off with the outside of the Google Pixel 4a, this phone on the front side was giving you a 5.81 inch OLED display. Now, this phone originally came out in 2020, right? So when you think about this particular device, you have to think back that this was one of those phones that Google made that was supposed to be a cheap budget phone. It was a bare bones structure. It wasn't supposed to be giving you anything super crazy. But even for a 2020 device, for what this phone was bringing you at that time, it was actually kind of impressive. And I was kind of shocked about what this phone was bringing at that time. So with that display, it was a hole punch display, which was very interesting because prior to this, every single Pixel phone never had a hole punch display. So their main flagships, the Pixel 4, 4XL, 3, 3XL, all those phones were not giving you any sort of hole punch display. So this one on their cheap budget phone offering at that time gave you a hole punch display with really the least amount of bezel we've seen on the Google Pixel. So that was something that was very, very surprising to me. And when you were going through and picking up a device, that was in and of itself something that was super crazy. So if you were in the market and you were going to go through and pick up this device, that in and of itself would have been a super wild thing to kind of think about there. And I remember buying this phone and thinking about it, from that side too, or maybe Google sent it to me, I don't remember. On the bottom, you were getting a USB Type-C port, which is still fine. I love having USB-C. It is one of my most favorite things ever. And you were also getting a headphone jack on this phone as well. So that right there too, imagine being able to go through and get a headphone jack, being able to go through and get this other capability too. That is kind of in and of itself another really cool thing to kind of think about here within your device. Like being able to go through and get that type of capability, in my personal opinion, was something that was so cool. And you were essentially getting that here on this type of device when it kind of comes down to it. So I do think from that side in and of itself, again, that is another really cool thing to kind of think about there too. On the back side, this phone was giving you a plastic back. This one was basically built completely out of plastic. So there was not a single piece of glass on this thing except for the front. So not like a super big deal either. But that was once again one of those really big things to kind of keep in mind there from that side as well. Now on top of that, you're getting a single camera setup on the back side. And that was kind of it, right? Now there were a lot of things that this phone was missing out on that a lot of phones basically have nowadays. Number one, you were not getting any sort of high refresh rate on this panel. So this thing was basically kind of stuck to what it was at right now. Right, so it was like it was a 60 hertz panel. It wasn't also really that bright either. So I felt like that was another really big thing. Like you weren't really getting like a super bright panel at that either. And then you were also basically still maintaining like a plastic back. Most phones nowadays have glass backs. No wireless charging on this phone either, which could have been a pretty big downside depending on how you're looking at it. And that's kind of it. I mean, again, you could look at it like no triple camera. I don't even think this phone had IP certification, which was kind of crazy. I think there was water resistance, but I think it didn't really have any IP certification there, which that in and of itself is another really interesting thing. So when you take a look at the Pixel 4a, there are definitely some areas of this phone that definitely do not hold up the best, but this was supposed to be a budget, like mid-tier budget. It was supposed to actually be a budget phone. So I can kind of forgive this phone for lacking some things at that time, 5 years ago. On top of that, this phone nowadays is going to cost you like less than $100 in a lot of places. So that is in and of itself another super crazy thing to keep in mind. Like you can go through and buy this phone and it's not really going to be costing you that much money. And I do think once again, that in and of itself is another insane thing to, kind of keep in mind. Like being able to go through and buy one of these types of phones and not really have it, cost that much money is super crazy as well. Now, when it comes down to the cameras, this phone is going to be giving you a 12.2 megapixel wide angle camera and an 8 megapixel wide angle camera on the front. So this is one of those types of situations where you can kind of look at these types of phones and be like, you know what? Definitely when it comes down to it, the Pixel 4a is from a price tag standpoint, the camera itself at that time, again, really was not that great, but it wasn't supposed to be that great of a camera. It was supposed to be a budget-tier phone, but even when compared to other phones in 2020, I think most phones were already at 4K at 60 at that time, but they were still getting better. But even with the Pixels, 1080p on the front, 4K at 30 on the back was the norm for a large amount of pixels, which was really annoying at that time. But Google ended up kind of adjusting it, but that was kind of an annoying thing that they ended up doing. But in and of itself, I will tell you, that is another really big thing to keep in mind here within this type of device when it comes down to it. So from that side in and of itself, that kind of covers it up there. From the software side, this phone did end up getting it got a few software updates, which I was really happy about. It got Android, 10, 11, 12, and all the way up to 13. There were probably some custom ROMs that allowed you to go and kind of use this phone too and kind of increase the support of this phone in some ways. But I would probably tell you with the Pixel 4a, in a lot of ways too, from the software side, again, when you're getting a Pixel, it is really one of the nicest things going on for this type of phone. So again, it's done getting software updates, and that would be the main reason why I wouldn't really recommend buying this phone anymore, but it still is kind of getting some security updates or some other battery updates. And this is the craziest thing. When it comes down to the battery, right, this thing is giving you a 3,140 milliamp-hour battery, but what ended up happening was, and at that time the battery life was pretty decent, but what ended up happening was that apparently a lot of people were running into random issues within their batteries. Like they were basically going through, and I guess there was for certain Pixel 4a models, there were some battery problems, and Google went through and pushed out an update for these battery issues, but it made the batteries on their Pixel 4a's like half the size, or like 40-something% of the size of what they should have been. So there's this whole thing going on right now, and the issue is still ongoing. And that in and of itself is such a crazy thing. I would have never thought that this random phone would have came back in the headlines again, but as of this point, it is back in the headlines. So it is kind of crazy. We'll have to kind of wait and see what happens there, but that is kind of an insane thing in and of itself. Now, another very big thing to keep in mind here too, is that with the Pixel 4a, the performance of this phone, it was basically giving you the Qualcomm Snapdragon 730G chipset inside with 6GB of RAM. And even at that time, like I mentioned, like the camera itself was kind of a weird improvement. This performance was also not that bad. This phone having 6GB of RAM at that time was actually very impressive. There weren't really a lot of Google Pixels that were giving you that much amount of RAM. iPhones weren't even giving you that much RAM at that time. So the fact that this phone was giving you that was also kind of crazy in my personal opinion. So I think when you're looking at this type of device, it is actually pretty interesting because in a lot of ways, this phone did kind of hold up better in some ways than some other devices. So overall, when I look at the Pixel 4a, I will probably tell you I would not really recommend buying this phone anymore. I don't think it was even worth buying last year or the year before. I think there are definitely far more superior devices to go ahead and buy rather than this one. But this phone was still good and decent, but it just really isn't worth buying. If you're planning on buying a phone, I would recommend buying something like a Google Pixel 7a. I think a 7a is a really good phone. A Google Pixel 7 in and of itself is nice. A Galaxy S23, an iPhone 14. Those types of phones I would recommend, starting from the highest to lowest, those are the phones I'd recommend. But other than that, that's kind of where we're at. And that's how the Pixel 4a kind of is holding up in 2025. If you have any other thoughts or questions, please let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that will mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.